Wait, what about weird?
Hi, I'm Echo.
And I'm Helena.
And this is our new podcast, What About Weird? Today we're going to be talking about split brain studies, also known as a corpus callosotomy. I really hope I said that right.
You would know better than I would.
I guess, should we just get into it? Oh, we should probably explain what the podcast is about a little bit.
No. Let them guess.
Leave them wondering. They will want more.
We'll get 12 episodes in and they're like, what the hell is this podcast about again? We wanted to start a podcast where we talk about everything weird, from cryptids and UFOs to weird science and unhinged history, because we have to tell somebody.
Yeah.
It's too much to hold in our tiny little brains.
So I suppose we'll go ahead and get started with the history of split brain procedures. So in the 1940s, about 26 people in New York underwent a new procedure, which was a treatment for severe epilepsy. At first,
it always starts with epilepsy treatments, doesn't it?
A lot of the time, yes. And
like,
I guess
any neuroscience is like, do they have epilepsy? What if we just cut them open, see what happens?
It was probably like one of the scariest things to witness, especially like these people have such severe epileptic cases. And a lot of it is because this is the type of epilepsy where it affects your entire brain. It basically causes an electrical storm in your entire brain and can lead to collapsing, and just it's the most severe form of seizure that you can have with this form of epilepsy, which, you know, has been really, really scary for other people to witness. So, of course, they'll try anything at this point. And especially, you know, if you are an epileptic, I'm sure, like, you know, you'd want to try anything. It affects your life
so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So they completed this procedure in the 1940s on 26 people, but it didn't really seem to work at first. So what they were doing was they were severing the bundle of nerve fibers that connect the two hemispheres of your brain. And this is known as your left brain and your right brain, or your left hemisphere and your right hemisphere.
Your left hemisphere and your left hemisphere.
Yeah, two lefts. It's like when people have two
lefts. Don't make a right. Don't make a right.
The bundle of neurons is called the corpus callosum. And so that's why this procedure is called a corpus callosotomy, which I'm just going to refer to as a split brain procedure, because there's no way I'm saying that over and over again during this podcast.
Every single time you have to say the full term.
No, I would die.
It's okay. I don't know how to pronounce science words much, so.
In 1962, they were finally showing improvement in these patients from doing this procedure.
So you said it was the 40s they did this procedure, but in the 60s they started seeing...
Yeah.
On the same people?
So no, like on different people, yeah.
Okay, so in the 60s they finally started doing it in a way where they were seeing results, not it took 20 years to see results from the original people.
Exactly.
Okay.
So what they think happened was the people that had it in the 40s, they weren't completely severing the corpus callosum. It was only like a partial amount. Mm-hmm. The idea behind that is that if someone suffers a seizure which starts as an electrical storm in one half of the brain,
it spreads.
Yeah, and it spreads to the entirety of the brain, which is why the seizures get so crazy and bad. When you sever the corpus callosum, it's no longer able to spread to the other half of your brain, so it's a little bit more localized, and it tends to be...
So it only affect one part of you?
Yeah, it just leads to it being way less severe, so you might not have fainting spells anymore, might not occur for as long or do as much damage. If they weren't able to sever the corpus callosum completely, then obviously that electrical storm from the seizure is still going to be able to travel to the other side of the brain, mm-hmm. and that's why they weren't really getting the results that they wanted. But yeah, in the 1960s, they were finally able to figure out how to completely sever it, and it seemed like this was, for the most part, stopping people's epilepsy.
You might talk about it, and my brain isn't coming up with any images, but wouldn't so you're severing the part in the middle, but mm-hmm. could it not travel through the spinal cord at all? Or, because isn't it like you have your cord and then you have the two halves?
Right.
and then you have the bit that connects like a walnut. You sever that bit, but is it just the way that the brain is? It just couldn't travel through the spinal cord, or it's just the paths that it take is in the central part of the brain, not
you're splitting all of those nerve fibers that connect the two hemispheres of the brain to themselves, and as long as all of those are severed, so you're still going to have some motor neurons that are connected to like your brain stem, because you don't want to disconnect it from your brain.
That sounds like a great way to die.
Yeah, exactly. Because then you're going to have spinal issues and all that sorts of stuff and motor issues.
Okay, that was going to be my next question.
Yeah,
does this affect motor issues overall?
Yeah.
Outside of just the seizures?
So the bits of the brain that connect to your other functions, it'll still connect to your optic nerves, and it'll still connect to your ears. So the other bits that are connected in the brain that are connected to the rest of your body are still completely intact. We're just cutting the bit that connects the two hemispheres of the brain in general.
So everything's intact, but they're just not, the two halves aren't connected, but everything else is normal.
Right.
I'm sorry, I keep interrupting. I'm just like, I need to know. I have many questions.
No, these are really good questions too, because I honestly didn't think about that until you asked about it.
And I'm not a neurosurgeon. I was always more into microbio anyway, so...
Mm-hmm. So this ended up being kind of interesting for the field of neuroscience, because now we were finally able to see how each half of the brain kind of functions without the other, because of course when you like get rid of the nerve fibers that connect to the two halves of the brain are no longer able to communicate with each other. So what's really interesting is there didn't seem to be a huge effect on the people at first. They feel completely normal. They live their completely normal person lives. It's not like when you get a lobotomy how you're completely different. Mm-hmm. These people are like completely the same as they were, and
just
they feel,
without the seizures.
Yeah, and they still have seizures, but not the really intense seizures that are going to do a whole bunch of damage or be life-threatening. So they did do some research on the initial group of epileptics that they did surgery on in the 1940s, but it was found that the separation obviously didn't noticeably affect their behavior, but it's suspected that the corpus callosum must not have been severed all the way, because it also didn't do much for their seizures. So then they wanted to do research again in the 1960s when they finally figured out that they completely separated the two hemispheres. Dr. Roger Sperry began his split brain research in cats and also in monkeys, where he observed that when the hemispheres are separated, they actually acted independently of one another, and the animals were even able to memorize twice the amount of information, which is really interesting.
Can I get one of these operations done? Go ahead and just do a little snip through my brain.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, maybe I'll actually be good at remembering stuff during exams. I don't know.
In the 1960s, with epileptics having undergone a successful split brain procedure for a few years, it was now Dr. Sperry's time to see how separation of the brain hemisphere worked in humans. After separating the two halves of the brain, they're obviously no longer able to communicate with each other. Any signal presented to the left side only would not be passed along to the right side of the brain. But there seems to be, as far as we know, no loss of brain function after the procedure. Barry and his graduate assistant, Michael Gazzaniga, showed almost immediately in their research that the brain has localized functions, which is also called hemispheric lateralization, meaning certain brain functions may reside only in or mostly in one half of the brain. So they were able to show that the two halves may function completely separate from one another and may even have different identities to some extent.
I'm assuming you don't mean different identities in, like, the classic movie, like, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde.
Right.
Sense. Just in, like, one side's more analytical and one side's more creative, or one side is more drawn to certain things and the other's more drawn to other things.
Yeah.
I'm assuming is what you mean, like...
Not complete, like, if you have, like, dissociative identity disorder, mm-hmm. where you're completely two or more different people, essentially,
yeah.
or you feel that you are... We'll get a little bit more into like later, because I'm gonna like address how it relates to human consciousness and all of that. And I'll explain it a little bit more.
Yeah, if I'm interrupting and you're ever gonna talk about something later, just be like, wait. Wait, your turn.
Hold that thought. So we have like the optic nerve.
This is me holding the thought in my hands.
This is an audio format. No one can see Elena literally holding the imagined thought in her hands.
You act like I care. This is for your eyes, so you know I am holding that thought.
So the optic nerve connects whatever visual stimulus is received in the eye to the visual cortex in the brain. And the visual cortex is actually located in the middle of the brain. So when the brain is split, each side still contains a section of the visual cortex, which is kind of in itself like their own little visual cortex. However, the optic
Take a
nerve...
drink every time you say visual cortex.
Oh yeah, really. The optic nerve kind of has its wires crossed, though. So when you see things in your right visual field, they actually go to the left side of the brain. And when you see things in your left visual field, they go to the right side of the brain.
Does it have to do with the way that it's literally like the wires crossed? Or is it how, like, with a lens, things are actually recorded upside down? I don't know physics too well, but you know how if you do, like, a pinhole camera, it'll be recorded it'll, like, come through upside down? Is it something like that, but it's like left to right type? Like it has to do with the light itself, or is it just like the optic nerves are just going meh,
Yeah, it's
crossed?
actually like the nerves themselves, because it's actually the same way with your motor neurons. Your
so
right
like
hemisphere...
the whole thing about being left-handed,
Yeah, exactly.
you're right-brained. Okay. That was going to be my next question, is if you were like, it is actually the nerves, if it has to do with...
If I'm being completely honest, you're really both brained.
Yeah, it kind of always seemed like BS.
Because it's... You could say, like, if you're left-handed, you're not necessarily right-brained. It's just that your right brain controls your left motor coordination.
Because
so, like,
you're left side dominant, you're right brain dominant. And that's about it.
Yeah,
Yes?
like in terms of like motor skills.
If you're left-brained or right-brained, you're like if you're one of these things, you're creative. If you're the other, you're analytical. And this is your zodiac sign.
Yeah, it's like you're really both. It's just, you know, you could say like
These are the nerves that fire more for doing certain tasks.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So, and we'll get into like the whole handedness, because there's really interesting differences in lateralization between like right-handed and left-handed and ambidextrous people. It's wild. There's a lot that goes into this that they found out.
I feel like we're like 4 sentences in. I'm already like, tell me everything about neurology. I need to know.
Let's write a new textbook. No. So basically, since the optic nerves are kind of crossed, that means if you present a picture only to your right visual field, the left brain will be able to register the information and process it, but the right brain will have no knowledge that a picture was ever shown. And then speech is localized in the left hemisphere. So if an image, let's say like a bundle of grapes, is shown to your right visual field, then the participant will be like, oh, I saw some grapes. But if it's shown to the, I said it was shown to the right visual field, right? Or did I say the left? Okay.
Right connects to the left connects to speech.
So if the bundle of grapes is shown to the right visual field and the speech is localized in the left hemisphere, then the participant will be like, oh, I saw a bundle of grapes. But if it's shown to the left visual field, then the person will be unable to say what they saw. And they'll usually even say, I didn't see anything, because their right brain has no way of communicating through speech.
Yeah, I didn't see anything that I can connect to words.
Right, exactly.
Even though you did see something.
Right, and so your left brain will be like, I didn't see anything, because it's the one that's talking. But the right brain could still draw the image that you saw with your left hand, because your right brain is controlling your left motor functions. So through this, we are able to determine, based on these experiments, that's how they were able to prove brain lateralization, that there's localized functions in the brain in the first place, because we never knew any of this before split brain.
Which would help if someone gets like brain damage on one side of their brain versus the other, or like if they have brain damage, you know, their speech function is affected. So now you know which side of the brain. Like, you could apply it in that sense, yes?
Yeah, yeah,
like someone
absolutely.
gets in a car crash or something.
Yeah, exactly. And they're like, oh, well, we know, like, this section of the left hemisphere was damaged because that's where speech
if you need to do
located.
brain surgery, you're not just hacking in there and being like, well, I hope this works.
Yeah,
Can you talk now, Billy?
Yeah, now there's been like enough studies of different brain injuries or different brain surgeries to know exactly like, you know, which hemisphere or even like which locations in certain hemispheres is where certain functions are located. And another really interesting thing is, let's say you present each visual field with a different image. Your right visual field is presented with the bundle of grapes, but your left visual field is presented with the picture of a cat. When you ask the participant what they saw, they will see the bundle, they will say grapes.
Because that's what they saw on their right side.
Right. But if you ask them to point out the image that they saw from like a group of images, they would pick out the cat.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's like mixed signals.
I want to do these experiments now.
I know, it's really interesting, isn't it? And so what's really interesting is sometimes your left brain will even just straight up lie to you. So they're like saying to the patient, why did you pick out a cat if you said that you saw a bundle of grapes? And because your brain needs to rationalize what just happened.
So these doctors are just gaslighting the patients?
Yeah, exactly. Well, in a little bit that, but also like your brain is also gaslighting you a little bit, specifically your left brain.
Man, you can't win for nothing.
Yeah, no. And so they'll be like, why did you pick out a cat if you said you saw a bundle of grapes? And your brain needs to rationalize what happened. And so the left brain, who can speak, will come up with an excuse. And the subject may say something like, oh, I guess I must have been thinking about my mom's cat, Lucy. Or something like that. Like, it'll just make up something that's completely not true, and then the subject will believe it. It kind of poses the question of how much could one half of your brain be lying to the other? Like, how much of our experience is real, and how much of it is your left brain rationalizing random stuff?
I have thoughts on this that aren't super, like, studied scientific, but will relate to UFOs and cryptids. If that's what you're... Like, if you see something out of... You know how a lot of people be like, hey, I just saw this, like... You know, I just saw a ghost. But if it's in the, like, one side versus the other, I wonder if that has to do with your perception. Mm-hmm. Or, like, if you only see someone walk through your left side of... Like, out of the corner of your eye, through one side, you know... You're registering, I just saw something, but because it's in the side that doesn't have word, that isn't connected to your, like, speech pathways, you don't have words for it, you can't describe it as well. Or I wonder if it's, like, you could draw it better here versus, like, with something strange, if it would process as something strange, or if it was something normal, it might process as strange, depending on which field of vision it's in, or if you could describe it or draw it better. I don't know. I'm just like...
Is with people
how
that
can I connect
have,
this to weirdness?
That's the thing, is like with people that have their corpus closed and like fully connected, no matter like what visual field you're seeing things out of, no matter like what side things are happening on, the hemispheres of your brain should still be communicating with you and receiving all of the information. But the thing that we learn from this is that we're always making rationalizations about what we saw. There's always going to be an excuse for the things that are happening.
Okay, so the thing with the cat and the grapes pictures, that was with people that didn't have their thing cut? Or people that did have it cut?
That did have it cut. Like, these are all studies in people that are split brain patients, so they no longer have a corpus callosum.
Did they do these experiments with someone that doesn't have the split brain surgery?
I don't believe so, but we do know just from what we know about the brains.
It'd be interesting.
If you can connect the two, your brains are...
Yeah,
the two halves of your brain are communicating.
That connection, you'd be processing both.
So like a normal person would see both of the photos and they'd be like, I saw a cat and grapes. And then when you ask them to pick out the certain photos, they would pick out both because their hemispheres are communicating. Okay, so
just ignore my whole point altogether that I made earlier about shadow people. I was under the assumption that they had discovered this with the people with the split brain, but we're doing these studies with people without the split brain. So just ignore everything I just said. I don't know what I'm talking about. I just wanted to talk about weird shit.
No, but
this is also weird shit.
Obviously, if one half of your brain is making this rationalization and just saying random stuff, I mean, you're going to do that regardless if you're a split brain patient or not. It's just in these cases, since these people don't have their corpus callosum.
It's more defined.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And so it's like, obviously, your brain is blatantly lying to you because the researcher knows that it showed you both. Like, if the left brain has no idea that the right brain saw a cat, and the right brain has no idea that it saw grapes, which is why when you, with your left hand, go to pick out what image you saw, you're going to pick out the cat. Mm-hmm. But when you say what you saw, you're going to say that you saw grapes. But your brain is like rationalizing why you got it different. And then here's like the bit about left-handed people may actually have less brain lateralization according to some studies, which means that the function of their brain may not be confined to one hemisphere. For example, like some of their speech might actually be located in the right hemisphere. I think it's something like 24% less lateralization that we see in left-handed people, which makes it interesting because it kind of raises the question of how a split brain procedure would affect left-handed people. So multiple experimental results showed that capacity for communication between the hemispheres varies both across patients and across tasks. So one aspect that may be important for individual difference is handedness differences, and variations in handedness may lead to differences in language capabilities in the right hemisphere and could even underlie differences in like interhemispheric integration. And so the problem is we don't have that many people that have undergone this procedure that we've tested on.
And there's only a certain percentage that are left-handed, so it's going to be, if there are people that have gone through that procedure, it's an even smaller percentage.
Right.
This is an interesting thing. If someone's, you know how a lot of people would be left-handed and then would become right-handed because some teacher told them not to. Like, mm-hmm. I used to be left-handed, now I'm right-handed because I had a teacher that was like, don't write with your left hand, you're going to run over your stuff, it's going to get all messy. And it's like, this is when I was, a kid, and this is, so I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And everyone else writes with their right. Mm-hmm. So I had so many left-handed people, whether, don't write with your left hand because it's wrong, or don't write with your left hand because it's the devil or whatever.
Right.
Are they able, because there's less lateralization, are they able to switch hands? Like switch which hand they write with? Easier than a right-handed person? If right-handed people were being told, if you write with your left hand, you look smarter, or something, something mm-hmm. like that, some reason, or like, and how would, if you then become, at a young age, like I did, you writing with my left hand and then becoming right-handed, would that change my lateralization? Or would it stay the same because while my brain was developing, but it was, like I was born left-handed, or like other people were born left-handed and then had to write with their right brain, mm-hmm. or write with their right hand, and that's all while you're growing up and your brain is still developing, would that then change? Or am I just going off the rails here? And I'm
that's a really
answer
good
my
point.
questions. You must know everything.
No, that's a really good point. So if you were born left-handed, that does mean that your brain lateralization is different than people who are born right-handed. It's inherently different. It's a little bit less lateralized. So you might have certain like sections of your right hemisphere that can do what your left hemisphere can do, or a certain section of your left hemisphere that could do what your right hemisphere can do. And so if you were to become a split brain patient, you might actually not have as much disunity between the hemispheres of the brain as right-handed people do. Now, what happens when you then tell a left-handed person that they're not supposed to write with their left hand when they're a child is we constantly throughout our lives have what's called brain plasticity, where
mm-hmm.
our brain can adapt to certain structural or environmental changes, and that never goes away in your lifetime. Your brain always has a certain level of plasticity, but because when you're a kid and your brain is developing and maturing and still becoming the structure that it is, mm-hmm. brain plasticity is way higher in children, and so there is probably a pretty good likelihood that your brain lateralization through the training of using your right hand would change, so that those motor functions are now going to be operating more in your left hemisphere since you're using your right hand. So yeah, it definitely changes a lot when you're a kid, but then also could still change throughout your life because of that brain plasticity.
Interesting.
And then another thing, I thought this was really cool. So split brain procedures can also lead to a symptom called alien hand syndrome, or it can also be called
heard
Dr.
this.
Strangeglove syndrome, which is a category of conditions in which a person experiences their limbs acting seemingly on their own without conscious control over the actions. So someone, like, there was one patient who was talking about making routine decisions, such as getting dressed in the morning, and it being much harder for her as a split brain patient because, let's say, like, the left brain wants to do something that's different than what the right brain wants to do. The left brain would want to put the clothes on for the day, and so your right hand is pulling up your pants. Your right brain will be like, no, I don't want to get dressed. And so your left hand will actively try to take off your pants. And so your hands will be fighting each other. One hand is like, no, put your clothes on. The other hand is like, take the clothes off. And it can be really frustrating. And that's where it kind of gets to the question of, do we now have two separate consciousnesses in this person? What actually makes you, you? I thought I was bad at decision making, but try having like two different people essentially in your brain that are fighting each other in one body. And so then we kind of question, like, are they equally both working together, or is the left brain really the bully because that's the one that gets to speak? And so are you mostly your left brain? Are you really both?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask is, like, if you don't have that split brain, would one, like, do we know which side is normally overriding the other? Like,
Right.
the side that's like, we're getting dressed.
Exactly.
Because that's what we have to do. Or the side that's like, no, we're not getting dressed. I want to keep laying in bed. Like, it makes you wonder about that, you know, of like...
And it could be like one way or the other, or it could be completely like, a lot of these are just complete individual differences, because we know that there are so many different things like handedness that could lead to you acting completely different as a split brain patient. And even when your hemispheres are connected, we all have such drastic individual differences that your right hemisphere could be making decisions perfectly fine, or for me, example, my left brain could be making like a ton of decisions and being like a bully to the right brain. Like, we just really... I'm sure there are some people that have done like a bunch of studies on this, and they're like, oh yeah, for sure, they're like really working together. I didn't super look into that, but I just thought that was like an interesting point, because it does make me kind of wonder, since the left brain is the one that is able to talk, how much it gets to dictate things that happen.
But the other brain is the one that... The other side of the brain was the one that, like, would point out stuff.
Right.
So it's like, if this is the one that's doing... This one's doing the talking, but this one's doing the movement. This side, one side's doing the talking, one side's doing the movement. Would one be the bully when it comes to, like, one side of your brain is saying, you know, someone cuts you in line. One side of your brain is like, oh, it's fine, they probably have a reason. And the other side is like, no, screw you. But the side that says no, screw you is the one connected to the voice. So that's the side that says no, screw you.
Yeah.
But if it's, you know, you're not gonna... If it's this thing where, like, maybe someone bumps into you and one side of your brain, the other side that's doing the movement would, like, shove them back, when the one that would be connected to talking... I might be misunderstanding this totally, but the side that's doing the talking would be like, oh, no, it's okay, like, would want to say, oh, no, it's okay, but the other one, because it's more of a movement-based thing, since someone had bumped into you, would be the one doing the shoving.
Right.
Does that make sense? Am I explaining myself right?
No, and I feel like that is like a question through some of it, is to what extent the decisions that you actually make is... I like to think that if you have your two hemispheres connected, it is probably like an equal decision between your entire brain before you actually do something, before you speak, because you're integrating all of the information.
There is no decision making going on in my brain before I say anything.
I guess that's fair, but it does make it harder for, like, specifically split brain people, because it does seem like, you know, their two hemispheres could be wanting two separate things, and then it's like, you know, if your right hand will try to get you to, you know, put your pants back on because that's what your left brain wants to do, but then your left hand is trying to pull them back down again because your right brain's like, no, I'm not ready to get dressed yet. And so, yeah, it makes it, like, really hard for them to make decisions. And there was even, like, this one patient where they actually got him to do, like, a version of 20 questions across his two hemispheres, which I don't know how they trained him to do this. It's remarkable to me. But the left hemisphere was able to guess the answer vocally, and the right hemisphere provided responses by, like, either pointing up which meant like guess a higher number, or like down, which meant like guess a lower number. And so what they would do is, you know, if they flashed, let's say like the number like 42 to the right visual field, the brain would play like 20 questions with itself, where the left brain would be able to vocalize and guess what the right brain saw.
Interesting.
Yeah, that makes it look like it's two people talking to each other. But there's also like a lot of evidence to suggest that clearly this is just you, and that's just a way of your brain compensating to be able to communicate with itself again. So a split brain patient can experience pain on both sides of their body. Each hemisphere of the brain processes pain information independently, meaning they might not be able to verbally report pain felt on one side of the body if the stimulus is presented to the hemisphere controlling the opposite side of the body due to the severed corpus callosum. So, which normally allows communication between the hemispheres. Essentially, each side of the brain feels pain separately without fully integrating the information with the other side. So, if you were to like feel pain on the right side of your body, your left hemisphere is going to be like, ouch.
But your right hemisphere, if you have it severed, would be like, what?
Yeah, but what they showed is that your body, even though the brains aren't connecting, both sides of the brain still know to some extent that you experienced pain, which I think is really interesting. So, like, pain is one of the only ways that they're still able to kind of be like, something's wrong. There's still actually a lot of information that can kind of go to both of the hemispheres. Maybe this isn't necessarily two consciousnesses, like maybe it's just one consciousness that's kind of fighting itself, because the patients still act completely like the normal selves. They can recognize themselves. If you show both of their hemispheres a picture of you, they're gonna know that in both hemispheres that that's you. And then if you're feeling pain, both hemispheres can be like, I'm feeling pain. It's not, oh, the left hemisphere over there is like feeling pain. It's like, I am
right
as this person feeling pain.
Land.
Yeah, exactly. So there's also evidence that although the two halves of the brain can no longer communicate, it's still one consciousness. But there's so much debate about all of this. There's so many like neuroscientists that are like, that's two different people in you that are just working together. And there are other scientists that are like, no, it's complete unity even when you've created some sort of disunity.
I mean, in the grand scheme of science, having only figured out how much we know since like starting this stuff really getting going in the 60s, in the grand scheme of science, that's not very long. So
yeah, exactly.
I'm assuming we still have like a long ways to go on this, and you know, we've barely just started scratching the surface.
Yeah,
because this is enough science to be done in one person's career. Like, you know, the person could have started and not have... Well, no, if they started in the 60s, they probably would have retired, but they could still be alive.
Yeah, like, I think there's still, like, and they still actually complete the procedure in, like, really extreme cases of epilepsy today. You know, though it's still not, like, super common. So we may never get to answer some of these questions, especially regarding the consciousness debate. The sample size really just isn't large enough to make super broad generalizations.
There's not enough for a good, proper scientific study.
Yeah, exactly. Like
given
when
all
you
the variables and everything.
Yeah, exactly. When you have such a like small sample size, and not only that, but you don't have like enough of a sample size between. We have this many left-handed people. We have this many right-handed people. We have this many like people that say that they're ambidextrous. We just can't make these giant broad generalizations. So I'm like presenting this research to you saying the patients that they tested and studied, this is what was happening to them. But this isn't like necessarily what happens to everybody, because there are, you know, individual differences in between like all of these studies that are occurring. But for the most part, this is what we're seeing when you get a severed corpus callosum. So they may actually do a lot more split brain procedures in children these days than they do in adults.
Because of the more plasticity and whatever?
Exactly. So the neuroplasticity is like the brain's ability to adapt and change its structure and function in response to new situations, behavior, or environmental changes. It involves basically neural reorganization that can include learning, maturation, and compensatory adjustments for brain damage or even aging. So neuroplasticity allows the brain to like basically reconfigure itself, making it possible to learn new skills and information. So that's exactly why we're able to learn at all, is because of neuroplasticity. And children, because of like they're in a developmental stage, have a lot more neuroplasticity than adults, which means that their brains are more malleable and it can adapt more easily to new experiences. So if they were to sever the corpus callosum, they don't usually completely sever it now. Now they do like a lot of partial.
They know where to sever it to get the right.
Yeah, I believe so. And even
without...
if they were to do a full, there's still a chance that your brain could adapt in a way to where the lateralization could be completely different so that both sides of your brain are able to control the same amount of stuff in your body just so that you're able to function a little bit better. Because there's been cases where like somebody will completely lose one entire hemisphere of their brain and over time be able to like, let's say like your entire left hemisphere is gone, especially in a child, you know, after like a certain amount of plasticity occurring and the reorganization of your brain structure, their right hemisphere may completely like integrate all of the functions that the left brain would have had so they could function with just one half of their brain.
Interesting.
Yeah. But yeah, that's basically it. I just thought it was really weird.
That is weird.
Yeah.
And cool.
It just brings up a lot of like questions about
consciousness.
Yeah, kind of like who are we?
Like dexterity and brain pathways.
Mm-hmm, exactly. I just felt like the experiments themselves were like really interesting. Just, you know, the brain gaslighting itself and, you know, the amount that, you know, we could possibly trick ourselves or rationalize things that, you know, don't necessarily need rationalization, but our brains will just do it because they feel like they have to make sense of the situation.
Mm-hmm. Which would raise a lot of questions for a lot of things.
Yeah, exactly.
Of like eyewitnesses to crimes or, like I had said earlier, with weird things, or also just like experiencing event and remembering an event for like later. Mm-hmm. If you're, you know, going to a concert and you're talking about it with a friend later, you know, or a show or something, like it brings up a lot of interesting questions about memory as well. I
definitely want to do a different episode on memory where I kind of talk about like misremembered things or even like memory implantation, because there are definitely so many cases of even like a trusted psychologist or therapist implanting memories in a patient, and so they think that that's actually what happened even though it never happened. Yeah, the brain is just...
Michelle remembers.
Yeah, no, exactly. I was literally about to say that. Yeah, it's just wild. The brain is so weird, and there's so much that we don't know about it still. Like, we still have to do so much neural mapping.
Yeah,
and
all that neuroscience is so fascinating to me, but I'm not smart enough for it.
I don't believe that. That's why you go to school for it.
Give me my little tiny bacteria, please. I like them.
Even bacteria are, like, so complicated. Like, there's so many of them. They're a lot more complicated than people would think, which is why, you know, part of the reason why I love microbiology.
I was going to say, that's why I love it.
Yeah.
As it's like, it does all these functions, but it's so teeny weeny.
Yeah, and there's so many different types of them. It's crazy. So, all right.
I guess that's all for this episode.
Always remember
to ask about the weird.
Bye for now.